exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what Kung Fu Podcast is all about. And I'm your host, T.W. Smith. We're going to be picking up in part 2 of taking the Bubishi back to its Chinese roots. In case you missed the first episode, I'd highly encourage you to go back because we're going to be picking up in 1/3 along the way here. And if you did, then let me give you a quick review of some of the things that we introduced. We introduced some comments from Jesse Encamp and the importance of the Bubishi in his personal training. We took a listen to part of Ian Abernathy's post, The Bubishi, Karate's Most Sacred Text. We've been building these around 2 separate essays from Dr. Ben Juckins over at Kung Fu Tea that you can get to at any point in time by going to kungfupodcast.com/Ben. And as well, we were introducing the concepts and the transformations of Patrick McCarthy's book, The Bubishi. And that also included a reference to Andreas Quast, who we're going to be picking up right there with him today, and his chapter, The Creator and the Creation. And we also introduced a thesis by Mr. Gary Krug, At the Feet of the Master, 3 stages in the appropriation of Okinawan karate into Anglo-American culture, published in 2001. I had also described the metaphorical example that I was taking with this particular series of podcasts, which was built around the U.S. Army's land navigational teachings, where basically before you decide that you're going to try to go anywhere, so for example, us trying to take the Bubishi back to China, you first have to determine where you are by fixed points that you can actually get out there and at least identify and then put back on the grid of your map. From there, you determine where you are. Then you can set a path in finding your way back. So with that being said, some of the fixed points we identified in episode 1, we are not discussing the 17th century version of the Wubeiji, or the Bubishi, as it was translated into Japanese. That was a separate, massive volume of work that we're not working with right here. We're talking about a different version altogether. We also identified as fixed point number 2 that there's been a real lack of scientific methodology that / forensic approach to this document that is being held in such high regard. In fixed point number 3, we see that the oldest copy in Okinawa is around 1930, with evidence leading that there were portions of its existence around 1880. We also know that as fixed point number 4 is that in Okinawa, the collection was initially passed down without any format title, and it also held the same sort of structure found in many Chinese martial arts manuals. For the most part, it looked like a good student's class notes. And fixed point number 5 that Mr. Ian Abernathy explained so well is that even with the Bubishi in your hand, a martial arts practitioner may not fully gain because of one of many reasons. And we went through those reasons in episode 1, so I highly encourage you to go back to listen to it if you missed it. And that brings us to part 2, the creation and the creator. Ben says that by far the most important addition in this new volume of the Bubishi by Mr. McCarthy is Andreas Quast's concluding essay titled The Creation and the Creator. It alone is worth the price of the book. Now, on a personal note, I have to tell you, I have read many of Dr. Ben Juckins' essays over the years. It is not often that he passes such a glowing, broad-stroke recommendation on a single piece of work, particularly just a single chapter in a whole volume of work. That should give you an idea of how important that one chapter is. Ben says that Quast's paper proceeds in 2 parts. In the first section, he carefully details what is known about the textual history of every manuscript confirmed or hypothesized relating to the Bubishi. That's what I was calling the fixed points. You have to find fixed points. This sort of work requires painstaking eye for detail and a massive amount of time doing very meticulous work. But this is exactly the type of work that is critical to establishing the dates of both the earliest existing manuscripts and as well as the probable origins of the Bubishi. The absence of that sort of discussion has been a real problem in the earlier editions of the book. Just as a reminder, Ben is referring to the Bubishi 2016 edition. You should be able to find a link to either iTunes or Amazon in your show notes and or on the webpage. I personally have the Apple iBook electronic edition, and it's great. Well, as part of that, Mr. Quast writes, quote, because in Funukoshi's print editions of 1922 and 1925, 4 articles were included that were subsequently identified as being part of the Bubishi in other lineages. It was naturally assumed that these originated in Asato and Matsumura. In fact, it seems that it was the very existence of exactly these 4 articles and other writings of Funakoshi that led Fujiwara and others to believe that they could only have been handed down from Matsumura via Asato, end quote. A little bit later, Quast writes, quote, Funakoshi's Ryuku Kempo Karate of 1922 is also the first printed book in history that included articles corresponding to what is considered the Bubishi today. Unfortunately, it were only 4 articles, and the same were also included in Rentan Goshin Karate Jutsu, published in March 1925. When 10 years later Funakoshi's Karate Do Kihon was published in May 1935, we find 3 new articles added, placed among the previous 4 articles. These 3 additional articles are not found in any other Bubishi-related manuscript. Furthermore, the 7 articles by Funakoshi in 1935 were only partly included in the English translation. It is also significant that nowhere in Funakoshi's books of 1922, 1925, and 1935 is found the title of or any other reference to the Bubishi, end quote. Now from there, Mr. Quast goes into an extraordinary detail on specific ships with specific manifests during the mid-1800s that demonstrates the details of events and presents a strong hypothesis and connections. Just as Ben said, the chapter alone is worth the price of the book. Which leads me to fixed point number 6. Funakoshi is the key. He is this critical component of the map that we're looking at. There's 4 articles, never a reference to the Bubishi in those first 3 publications. He's almost like his life and his presentation, his work is like a trail through this mountain forest. It takes us from one side that we know of the Bubishi, and it begins to hint back, returning us to the place that was known as the Wubeiji. But the thing is that it's not a straight trail. Of course it's not. What fun would that be? It's got these little curves and nuances and details that leaves this sense of mystery all the way around it. Quast found that in the oldest hand-copied manuscripts still in existence date only to the 1930s. This is of some concern, as it is the same decade in which karate began to be popularized on the Japanese mainland, and the first translations of the Bubishi were published. While Quast finds evidence of older manuscripts dating back to the 1880s, these items were physically destroyed in the Battle of Okinawa or due to various earthquakes and fires that periodically afflict the region. Now, while you can be confident that a Bubishi-like tradition existed in Okinawa during the late 1880s, it is actually impossible to say exactly what it contained on the basis of the sources that currently exist. This fact will become of greater importance as Quast reaches the conclusion of his essay. It is also interesting that Quast's textual criticism, while not resolving all of the outstanding questions, tends to cast a shadow of doubt on those theories that see a very early date, such as the 18th century, for the text transmission to Okinawa. Well, that statement reminded me of what Professor Kevin Tan had to say when we were doing the podcast on constructing a martial tradition, rethinking a popular history of Karate Do, where he writes, quote, "Remain cautious, for the act of remembering karate in a distinct textualized format did not seem to exist until the late 19th or early 20th century through the combined efforts of Okinawan karate elites and Japanese policymakers. Much of what is considered to be unproblematically traditional may at times be more of a result of present-day inferences, end quote. Well, Ben continues in his essay, and he says that Quast sees a few basic possibilities when he turns his attention to the matters of the origins of the Bubishi. To begin with, he notes that the Bubishi is much more likely a collection of texts rather than a single authored work. Given that not all the articles within this volume date to the same era, they don't reference the same geographic regions, or even discuss the same subjects. This is probably obvious to anyone who reads it, but it's worth saying anyway. Now, we're going to start turning our shoulder a little bit. We're going to start to blade ourselves in a direction that we're going to start looking more now toward its Chinese roots. And let's start broad. We know that martial clans and individuals in China did assemble textual collections similar to the Bubishi. Wing Chun students can see and even read a document similar to the Bubishi at the Ip Man Tong in Foshan because he carried it around with him. However, what seems to be a little premature in Andreas Quast's essay is that he dismisses the possibility that a single family or a small group of private individuals might have assembled a collection of texts such as this on Okinawa. Instead, Quast favors one of two possibilities. The first is that a book of this degree of sophistication was acquired by an Okinawan official and it was maintained in multiple official copies by the government. This would yield a relatively earlier date. Alternatively, Quast notes that such a collection could have been assembled by the sorts of martial artists, rebels, and revolutionaries that occasionally fled from China to Okinawa in the late 19th or early 20th century. Once in Okinawa, the various texts, which are now referred to as the Bubishi, may have been adopted as they seem to capture the same flavor of national resistance and community myth-making that many Okinawans were then invested in. This would suggest both a later date of entry and a more tangential relationship with karate's early development. However, to Ben's scholarly opinion, the later date also seems to fit the time period of many of the more interesting articles that are included in the Bubishi. Certain ideas, such as the sick man of Asia or the trauma of the Boxer Rebellion that strongly mark later martial manuals, are notably absent from this document. As such, Ben suspects that it is probably predating 1900. Yet for some of the other articles, there could be a range of dates here. Some of the monk's fist material, including the list of movements in the various training forms, seem to be older than that. A few training manuals from the 1700s contain similar lists of names. In contrast, the pairs of winning and losing techniques that come complete with the illustrations bear an uncanny resemblance to the printed version of a very similar piece of material that the British writer LCP found and described in a local marketplace in Guangzhou during the 1870s. So let's put a pause in it there because we have a little footnote right there. Ben's reference to British writer LCP is slated for a future podcast. However, as an introduction, Ben writes, quote, "The September 1874 issue of the China Review ran a brief piece titled The Noble Art of Self-Defense in China. The article was published by an educated British gentleman who evidently had some interest in boxing and went by the initials LCP. It is considered to be a very important text for several reasons. And like I said, I'm going to bring you the full version of it later. LCP in his writing includes social context of marketplace vendors, soldiers, opera singers, and public commercial martial arts instructors, something that was usually not attributed to such an early date. It is clear from LCP's descriptions that already by the 1870s printed martial arts manuals in China were not rare at all. Instead, they were inexpensive and a common good available in southern Chinese marketplaces. So we're going to come back to LCP's writing a little bit later, but I wanted to give you an idea about what that reference meant. Now, as we continue with the essays in the following the Bubishi, Other materials, such as the history of white crane boxing, appears to be from an even more recent period when creation myths of the weak and the feminine overcoming the hard and the foreign become culturally important and increasingly reified. Douglas Weil, in his own treatment of the origins of the Tai Chi classics, found that such themes were particularly popular in the 1880s, as well as the self-strengthening movement, which encouraged martial artists to search their own stories and cultural histories for the key to resisting foreign imperialism. Some of the texts within the Bubishi resonate with Douglas Weil's findings. Solid confirmation of these dates will require additional research. That would probably take the form of a detailed comparisons within previously unpublished versions of similar texts from Chinese collections. Yet, Ben says that a cursory reading suggests that in addition to a variety of authors, subjects, and styles, the articles within the Bubishi may also reflect the sorts of trends and concerns seen within the Chinese martial arts literature during different points in the 19th century. That further suggests a Chinese textual tradition that preceded what was later imported to Okinawa, which I marked as fixed point number 7. There's enough research that suggests that there was a version and a lineage of what we call the Bubishi in China in a time during the mid-late 1800s. And then there's the final point that Quast makes in his essay, and it's all about what is missing from the Bubishi. A number of similar texts in China include discussions of armed combat. For example, Hu Di Dao, or what is known as butterfly knives, or the double short broadswords. Also, sabers, poles, spears, and shields were also commonly carried by militia members and became the focus of Southern Chinese martial arts training. Yet any discussion of armed training is conspicuous by its absence from existing Bubishi texts. Nor is there any hint of militia organization or community defense in these texts. These Okinawan versions of the text are also self-consciously oriented towards civilian personal defense, health, and leisure. Such a vision of the proper social role of the martial arts is also suggestive of a very late 19th or 20th century date. At this point, Quast reminds us that the oldest existing examples of this textual tradition date only to the period that karate was coming under intense pressure to conform to Japanese social expectations about what a proper, ancient, and authentic system of unarmed martial arts should be. It was within this specific environment that the Okinawan Bubishi first came forth. Ben states that we generally think of the Bubishi as a text representing the tradition from which karate first emerged. It is the origin. It's the creator. It is what is authentic and legitimate. Our modern forms of practice are the creation. In a word, they are derivative. These are the terms that many of the modern introductions and prefaces included in the 2016 Tuttle Expedition explicitly encourages readers to think within. The Bubishi holds the key to forgotten combat applications. It is a font of ethical martial wisdom as well as esoteric knowledge. It can lead to a sense of renewal for students whose practice has become stale. Within these pages, we can commune with the minds of the founders. And as you're reading through the praises, it is absolutely clear that the Bubishi has come to be much more than a book. It is an artifact whose very physical existence legitimates one's martial practice. There is nothing in particular unique about that, though. Kennedy and Gao noted that the Chinese martial manuscript tradition existed in large part to convey legitimacy rather than just simply knowledge. Yet, as the essays and prefaces of this volume makes clear, such functions have carried over into the age of digital reproduction with surprising efficacy, which starts leading me into why don't Chinese martial artists use the Bubishi more? And a degree of caution may be called for here. Martial arts studies notes that all martial practices, to a large extent, are invented traditions. Applying this general principle to the Bubishi, Kwa suggests that there might be a more obvious explanation for the lack of weaponry, as well as the general tightness of fit between karate's early philosophy and what is seen in the Bubishi. In Kwa's view, it is entirely possible, or even most likely, that the original manuscript tradition contained additional material that was simply edited out of both hand-copied and later printed versions of these texts because it did not meet the Japanese expectations of what karate should be. This is an intriguing possibility, given that the small number of actual manuscript lineages and the dearth of truly older copies. It would be hard to falsify this hypothesis. Ben reemphasizes that even though that hypothesis would be almost impossible to falsify, we must be careful not to rely heavily on the arguments from silence. After all, there were many Chinese manuscript traditions that did discuss weapons, but not every one of them did. There are several Chinese martial arts manuals that are solely dedicated to hand-to-hand combat. Yet Quast raises very critical questions. Manuscripts, particularly during that time, do not simply propagate themselves. They are copied or not fully copied by individuals for specific reasons at a given point in history. So with that fact, the older manuals are just as much as the products of existing social discourses as they are artifacts from an unsullied past. Perhaps we should accept the fact that it may not be totally possible to use the Bubishi to completely decipher karate's deep origins, which leads me to fixed point number 8. Most, but not necessarily all, of the Chinese martial arts texts had a weapons section. The fact that it isn't present in some form, as well as tactics and techniques on how to work collectively in the handwritten Okinawan copies, raises suspectful questions about its edited versions. Ben states another important fact here that I've also heard from Chinese martial artists, and he says that very few individuals in Japan can read the Bubishi as it is written in a combination of classical Chinese and the local Minnan dialect of China's Fujian province. When accounting for the various textual errors that arose from poor copying and mistakes in the transcription of local dialects, it is a challenging document for anybody to work with. And I've heard that, like I said, many times in the past from Chinese martial artists, who, especially anyone who was born after the 1940s, reading the classical traditional Chinese is really, really tough, much less a specific dialect out of a specific area. With all that being said, it is a uniquely Chinese document, one that is tied to the Fuzhou region and the folk martial art tradition still popular in the area to this day, including White Crane and Luhan boxing. As such, the Bubishi is potentially an invaluable textual witness to a period of rapid transformation within the Southern Chinese martial arts. Yet students of Chinese martial arts history, for the most part, have passed over this manuscript tradition in silence. Ben also writes that he has also found that the general silence surrounding this book in the Chinese martial arts curriculum to be somewhat mysterious, which was one of the things that led my first questions and the whole thing that stimulated these podcasts, was that, after all, so many of our debates of the evolution of the modern Chinese martial arts revolve around events that took place in the second half of the 19th century. And while a number of late 19th and early 20th century manuals from northern China have been translated and widely distributed, for example, the Tai Chi classics, how many translations of southern China's rich manuscript literature of, for example, cotton boxing or bronze man manuals do you have sitting on your bookshelf? And the answer is probably none, and you're not by yourself. So it is understandable that the students of Chinese martial studies might neglect this text, simply because of the reference to the Bible of karate. It is dismissed before it's even opened. Most of these Chinese martial arts students probably don't even know that it is a Chinese text through and through. But if you take a moment and open the pages, you're going to quickly discover It is a small library of textual fragments that deal with white crane and monk fist boxing, traditional Chinese medicine, combat tactics, and martial ethics. Much, though not all of this literature, refers to places and traditions that will be familiar to students of the Southern Chinese martial arts. So while questions of dating and provenance greatly troubles attempts to easily relate these texts to modern Chinese practice, even a quick look at the various illustrations that accompany the text suggests that Chinese martial artists are likely to find it interesting. Southern China has a long history of producing martial arts manuals. Unfortunately, they have not generated the same degree of interest among historians and practitioners as the northern works, like we said, as the Tai Chi classics. Many of these older southern manuals reside in the cabinets of private collectors and in the special collections of departments of university libraries. And in their general format, many bear more than a passing resemblance to the Bubishi. As mentioned before, Ip Man owned one such collection containing both a boxing and medical manual that he inherited from his teacher. Visitors to his museum in Foshan can see that hand-copied manuscript on public display. But like so much of Southern China's martial literature, there has yet to be a serious scholarly effort to translate, describe, and classify these works. Which leads me to fixed points number 9 and 10. It is very difficult to read the original classical Chinese, even for the Chinese. And fixed point number 10 is that most Chinese martial artists don't use the text referred to as the Bubishi or the Wubeiji. They silently look past it, or they mock it. With these 10 fixed points, let's begin to look further into even more recent research and what it's going to have for you to consider. Okay, so we're going to put a bookmark in it here because I still have quite a bit to cover in this next episode or two. It's probably going to be just one more, maybe a long one, but it'll probably just be one more. I can't encourage you enough to at least put 2 documents. I'm going to actually have 3, but 2 highly recommended documents into your library. If you don't have the newest edition of the Bubishi, get it. It's a good idea, and it's going to have a lot of good stuff in it. And second, get Ben Junkins' book, The Creation of Wing Chun. I'm going to tell you that there is so much information in there and so much real history. You've heard me talk about Ben on many, many occasions. That book covers a lot more than just Wing Chun. You would do very well to have it in your library. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. Thank you so much for joining me today, where we started the part 2 of taking the Bubishi back down to its Chinese roots. We've got 10 fixed points. I could probably have 12 or 14, but 10's a good number right now. And we're going to be looking in further detail in southern China coming up very, very soon. So I look forward to talking with you. Remember, the most important things about your martial arts training is that the training, the practice. First, start with the objective. What is it you're trying to achieve? If you're practicing for sports, good. If you're practicing for a philosophical way of life, good. It's all good. What's important is that you know what you're practicing for. Then second, make sure that your training supports that objective. Don't do one without the other. And then third, give it your best. No matter what you do in your training, as I tell my students, you might make a mistake here or there. You might make a mistake in your objective, that you had the wrong objective going in there. You may make a mistake in your tactics. You don't do that in this particular set of circumstances. Or you could have done it better. But there's one thing that you should never make a mistake in, and that is in your effort. Always put forth your very best effort so you got one variable, a fixed point that you know that wasn't the problem. I may have done it wrong, but I did it wrong at 100%. So I know that that wasn't the problem. Effort, keep that as a fixed point in your personal martial arts training. Take care, and I'll be talking with you again real soon.